Pan Democrats call decision to bar Eddie Chu from the election political intimidation. Hong Kong and Asian stocks surge on US-China trade truce. And experts warn humanity running out of time to stop worst impact of climate change.
Good evening. Pan Democrats are on the warpath after last night's disqualification of lawmaker Eddie Chu from a rural election. They questioned the reasoning behind the decision and say it's another step in a worrying direction. Kana Chu reports.
Lawmaker Eddie Chu shared more of his thoughts today, a day after he was disqualified from running in a Yuen Long Village representative election.
I am approached by international media to cover this event, this incident, and I will tell them, well, this is once again an example that Hong Kong government does not respect one country, two system.
This morning, 24 pan-democratic lawmakers criticized the government for undermining the rule of law by the decision to bar Chu.
Under the Basic Law, the oath requirement simply does not include rural village representative elections, and they are now obviously not just trying to take your seat away from the Legislative Council. They simply would shut you out the door of any political election in Hong Kong.
The red line is being drawn closer and closer. We're afraid that this extension could go beyond that further.
Chu submitted his nomination form on November 22nd. It was not until last night that his candidacy was revoked. The returning officer attributed Chu's disqualification to his failure to provide direct answers to questions related to Hong Kong independence. A pro-establishment lawmaker supported the government's decision.
To be fair, it is expected all candidates should fulfill the same requirement. That is a very basic requirement. That is, you have to show that you are basically support of the basic law.
Concerns have also been raised whether Chu's LegCo seat could be retracted on similar grounds. Senior counsel Ronnie Tong said under the Basic Law, the LegCo president can declare that a lawmaker is no longer qualified for office upon breach of oath or misbehavior. However, the motion has to be first passed in a vote by 2/3 of all members of the Legislative Council that are present. He noted this is something that would be impossible to achieve by relying on the pro-establishment camp alone. Kana Chu, TVB News.
Stock markets across Asia welcomed the 90-day trade ceasefire announced by China and the United States over the weekend, but some analysts fear the wave of positive market sentiment could be as temporary as the truce to the Sino-US trade war. The 90-day truce called by President Xi Jinping and his US counterpart Donald Trump was just the respite markets were looking for following months of uncertainty sparked by the trade war. Trump agreed to hold off on raising tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports from 10 to 25% on January 1st. In return, Beijing will buy more American goods to reduce the glaring trade imbalance and attempt to address US concerns over its economic development strategies. But as many analysts have since pointed out, core differences remain in their dispute that are unlikely to be resolved after 3 months. It seems impossible that Beijing will scrap its industry and technology development policies, which Washington says are based on theft. This means all the positive market sentiment generated by the ceasefire is based on something that might never materialize. But it was all the impetus needed by investors looking to make a quick buck. The Hang Seng Index surged 2.5% to 27,182, with turnover rising to $129 billion. Technology stocks soared on hopes that sales will pick up pace again. There were concerns recently that electronic gadgets would suffer the most if the trade war escalates. Tencent rose 4.1% to $324.80.
a lot of investors are expecting over the next 90 days, US and China might be able to work out a deal that will end the so-called trade war at the moment. Even though it's still far away from the goal, investors are still a little bit optimistic about, at least now the trade war will not be worsened at this moment.
On the mainland, the yuan firmed as Shanghai shares posted their biggest daily gain in a month. The Shanghai Composite rose 2.6% to 2,654 points. Across the region, markets in Japan, South Korea and Australia all posted gains between 1 and 2%. President Xi Jinping arrived in Panama City in his first state visit to the Central American nation. In a bid to shore up political and economic ties, Xi said China and Panama were natural partners to cooperate on his country's Belt and Road Initiative. Ahead of his visit, Xi heaped praise on the country in a local Spanish-language newspaper, saying Panama enjoyed world fame for the Panama Canal, geisha coffee and tasty tropical fruits. Panama broke off ties with Taiwan last year to establish ties with Beijing. The Dominican Republic and El Salvador swiftly followed in cutting out the island, which China claims as its own. Well, shortly before he flew to Panama, President Xi signed new trade deals with Argentina, which just hosted this year's G20 summit. Xi and his Argentinian counterpart Mauricio Macri announced more than 30 agriculture and investment deals. They include an agreement to send Argentine cherries to China, as well as an expansion of a currency swap. China is among Argentina's top export markets and one of its biggest lenders, financing more than $18 billion in infrastructure and other projects.
Over to Poland, where delegates from nearly 200 nations are gathering for 2 weeks of talks aimed at preventing global warming. The United Nations insists this is their deadline to either act or continue to destroy the planet. The 24th Conference of the Parties, or COP24, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This meeting comes 3 years after the landmark Paris Climate Change Agreement set a goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Since then, negotiations on implementing guidelines to that were launched. 2 weeks of COP24 meetings was then set as their deadline to either put up or shut up because the consequences of ignoring climate change are dire.
We have clear signals about the urgency with which we need to address the issues of climate change. The effects that are happening are affecting communities around the world, casualties, destruction in so many places, suffering, a lot of suffering derived from the consequences of climate change.
As a prime example of countries failing to understand the gravity, Greenpeace is condemning a court in Slovakia for arresting activists for displaying anti-coal mining banners.
This is the moment of solidarity. We need to be clear that activism is not a crime. They didn't disturb any sort of operations, and now they are facing unfounded criminal charges.
This group of Going Green campaigners are leading the example on green-worthy lifestyle choices. They cycled into the Global Climate Conference after riding more than 600 kilometers to raise awareness of the need to tackle climate change.
We are working towards making the Paris Agreement operational, and so the next 2 weeks would be heavily intense in terms of getting all the countries together to agree on a very solid rule book that will operationalize the Paris Agreement.
To show their solidarity, tens of thousands of demonstrators took to the streets of Brussels to stand up for those who suffer the most from climate change.
Damaging simple farmers in Africa and Asia who have nothing but a field of potatoes, who's going to be completely overtaken by the sea.
And speaking of talks, French President Emmanuel Macron hopes talks between political leaders and demonstrators will put an end to the rioting in Paris. After inspecting the sites vandalized the most, Macron held an emergency meeting with key leaders. Protesters are warning they'll continue demonstrating against rising taxes and living costs. This is why Macron ordered his prime minister to coordinate talks aimed at stopping the violent rioting and creating new protest security measures. With more than 400 people arrested, riot police admit they were overwhelmed. The head of police blames the rioting on radical far-right and far-left activists. He said they attacked police with hammers and rocks.
And still to come on tonight's news. Occupy co-founder elaborates in court on reasons to launch the movement. Qatar to quit oil production group OPEC in January. And special stamps to honor the works of Louis Cha.
心田藥妝有20幾款唔同嘅 mask 俾我揀，隨我心情，隨我需要自由去打，要靚就要 Day Day Mask 心田藥妝。
And welcome back. Occupy co-founder Chan Kin-man continued to testify at the public nuisance trial, which entered its third week today. He argued the act of civil disobedience from occupying the central area was proportionate to the aim pursued. Haley Zhou has more.
What kind of response from Hong Kong citizens could be considered just about right in the face of an unjust election system? Occupy movement co-founder Chan Kin-man gave this answer as he continued to defend himself in court today. Chan believes the act of civil disobedience that paralyzed parts of the city for 79 days in 2014 could be a proportionate measure. And the movement did not go beyond what was necessary to achieve their goal, to raise the public's attention and show the government the high level of dissatisfaction that was rife among citizens. Chan said their goal was to have tens of thousands of people occupying this central area. He explained the number of protesters expected was based on the city's previous experience. For example, in 2012, when tens of thousands of people protested against national education for 10 days, the government scrapped its plan to implement it. The trio decided to occupy the central area because it symbolizes the central values of Hong Kongers, such as their right to universal suffrage. Chan said if people do value this right, then they would put up with short-term disruptions. He also believed if the people turned up in such large numbers, the government would reconsider its proposal. Chan also stressed the act of civil disobedience was a last resort. It would only be put into action if all other measures fail. But Chan admitted that it was only after many protesters left once the trio announced the start of the movement that he realized not everyone agreed with their way. It was also revealed by Chan today there was a lack of direction agreed between the student leaders and the Occupy co-founders on how the movement should be carried out. Haley Zhou, TVB News.
4 defendants who faced rioting and other charges in relation to the Mong Kok unrest nearly 3 years ago appeared in court today. Sharon Tang has details.
Currently serving term in prison, activist Edward Leung appeared at the High Court this morning. The defendants also include Lee Nok Man, Lam Ngo Hin and Yong Wai Ip. This comes after Hong Kong indigenous leader Edward Leung was slapped with 6 years behind bars earlier in June. Leung then decided to appeal the conviction and sentencing he received. Before opening the case, senior counsel Eric Kwok urged the jury to forget about comments they have seen or heard in the past. They should also avoid being wavered by their political stance and should follow the judge's instructions to reach a decision. The prosecutor first recounted the events in a chronological order. In what was described to be the first stage of the unrest, he said it all started when Hong Kong indigenous called on the public to gather at Portland Street on February 8, 2016. He noted that officers of the Hawkers control team did not intrude on the hawkers at that time. However, surveillance camera footage shows that at 9:30 that night, 2 people wearing shirts with Hong Kong indigenous written on it were seen pulling hawkers onto the streets. Officers then tried to stop them, but were later surrounded and verbally abused by members of the public. The hearing will continue tomorrow with more video evidence, including phone-taped footage provided by Hawker control team officers. The prosecution also expects to call on 57 witnesses to testify. Sharon Tang, TVB News.
On Wednesday, the Transport Department will meet representatives of the non-franchise bus industry to discuss remedial measures following that deadly bus crash in Xingyi. It will also continue the probe into the coach involved, which wasn't licensed to run an employee bus service.
All those new coaches now running in Hong Kong basically have seatbelt installed. The only difference is whether or not we should legislate to make its use mandatory, taking into account the entire operation, the cost and benefit, as well as the practicality of this.
A Beijing official visited the Legislative Council building today. Basic Law Committee Chairman Shen Chunyao arrived at the building at around 11 a.m. and met with LegCo President Andrew Leung. Accompanying Shen was Chen Dong, a deputy director of Beijing's liaison office in Hong Kong. Andrew Leung said Shen was on a courtesy call, and the two did not discuss lawmaker Eddie Chu's disqualification from running in a rural election. Shen left around half an hour later and did not respond to reporters' questions before leaving.
Overseas again, and the Persian Gulf state of Qatar says it's withdrawing from OPEC. This marks the first time a Middle East nation has left the cartel since its founding in 1960. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It says a decision to leave OPEC will allow it to focus on gas production. It plans to increase its exports from 77 million tons of gas per year to 110. Qatar also wants to raise its oil production from 4.8 million barrels a day to 6.5. And Mexico's newly elected president is already showing he's a man of his word by selling off a presidential jet to push his austerity agenda. Andrés Manuel López Obrador campaigned that he would lead Mexico without all the presidential luxuries. So the Boeing 787 Dreamliner with beds, shower, and a gorgeous bathroom will be sold to use the money for the people. An additional 60 smaller planes and 70 helicopters will also be sold off as López Obrador plans to fly coach. He also doubled down on stemming the country's rampant violence and rising murders. To do that, he'll use the military to help fight crime and drug cartels. And finally, fans of the late martial arts novelist Louis Cha will soon be able to celebrate his works with a series of special stamps. The set was inspired by some of the most famous characters from Cha's books. Here's Caleb Leung with all the details.
Guo Jing and Huang Rong from the Eagle Shooting Heroes. Yang Guo and Xiao Nongnu from the Giant Eagle and its Companion. Wei Xiaobao from The Deer and the Cauldron. These characters may not be familiar to readers steeped in Western literature. They hail from a collection of martial arts novels inked by Louis Cha, better known by his pen name Jin Yong. The characters are widely cherished by Chinese readers. Hong Kong Post announced today that it will release a set of special stamps on the theme of characters in Jin Yong's novels. Li Qiqing, the illustrator who designed the stamps, is hoping to use this chance to commemorate Cha. Li remembered meeting Cha's son Andrew earlier in the year. Andrew asked Li at the time to bring a set of the stamps to Cha when they were published to give something for him to be thrilled about. Cha passed away in October at the age of 94. Li said this made the issuing of this set of stamps especially meaningful and emotional for him. Associated philatelic products include a stamp booklet with 30 stamps featuring Zhang Wuji, the main character in the Heaven's Sword and the Dragon's Saber, practicing Tai Chi. People can flip the pages of the booklet quickly to see this supreme kung fu in consecutive moves. The post office reminded stamp collectors that their products will only be date stamped with the special postmark on December 6th. Caleb Leung, TVB News.
And that's our news.
Thanks for watching.